On October 14th, the incredible happens. Endurance is freed from the ice, and the crew is able to sail. They only make it a few hundred yards, a couple of lengths of the ship, but they have tasted freedom. The ship is still seaworthy. But upon being recaptured by the ice vice, Endurance would never sail another yard.
We made many interesting geological and scientific discoveries and had many narrow escapes throughout the whole time. Having done a work that has resulted in great advantage to science, and for the first time returning without the loss of a single human life. And throughout all this, I was helped by a party of men who were regardless of themselves and only thinking of the good of the expedition.
Hey, welcome to all of you, bandits and chilies. This episode is called Shackleton Series Part 2, Endurance Sunk but Not Lost. Last episode, we left Ernest Shackleton and the crew of Endurance in early October of 1915. They had just survived the Antarctic winter, frozen in an ice drift in the Weddell Sea. They had faced Antarctic blizzards in the long, dark winter that they had endured as the days shrunk into nothing more than occasional twilight. They had to dig their dogs out of the snow that was dumped by the blizzards. Eventually, the sun began to appear again. They were now well into spring. The days were not just existent, not just getting longer, but they had now passed the spring equinox, and they would gain roughly an additional hour of sunlight per week. Whilst the winter had been brutal and the men would have seriously contemplated their own deaths, in some ways, the worst would have seemed to be over. The longer days and increasing sunlight would loosen the grip of the ice. Finally, they would be able to take back some control over their own destiny as they sought to sail out of the breaking up pack ice. However, another season of darkness really overlapped with and lagged behind the grim winter. As early as July of 1915, they had begun to have serious doubts of being released to sail out of the grip of the ice. Distant storms acted on their frozen world like a mighty giant beneath the ice, causing rumbles and crashes. This caused plates of their thick pack ice to raft up or climb up to 15 feet in the air as they clambered for position above, below, and beside one another. This terrifying sight, which began in the full dark of the Antarctic winter, prompted the beginning of a 24-hour watch by the crew. Elsewhere in the world of 1915, 24-hour watchers were looking out across fields and trenches for enemy activity. But the enemy that Shackleton's crew were watching was vastly more powerful, and crucially, it was also the very surface on which they were living. Creaks and groans emanated from the ice, and the ship sang in response with its own chorus from its boards and beams, just like the director of the Dogs' Choir, Hercules, who was often the instigator of a howl amongst the Siberian huskies. Towards the end of July, they seemed to be entering this parallel season of trouble in earnest. As one winter was beginning to turn towards spring, another, more sinister season of darkness was emerging. The ship was shaken by heavy bumps in the night. Not the night and day, not yet. The days were yet to return. August 1st marked exactly 1 year since Endurance had left London. And to celebrate, the cracking and rafting pack ice began to really tip the ship to one side and then back. The intensity of this rafting ice was such that the men had to bring all of the dogs on board the ship. For now, that was the safest place. It got so bad that they were simultaneously pushing ice blocks away from their rudder with poles and also standing by ready to jettison the lifeboats and abandon ship. But then, suddenly, the heaving and crashing of the ice floes stopped in an instant. Antarctic serenity prevailed once more. Their ship was still, and their ship was still on the move as the ice drifted them further north. Have you ever seen rust and thought that it looked as though the metal was burnt? If you compare a rusted piece of metal and a burnt piece of wood, there are a lot of similarities. This is because the combustion of wood and the corrosion of iron are the same process, just happening at different speeds. Oxidization. The pace of this oxidization in wood is so fast that it emits a visible flame as a result of this transfer of energy. But slowing that pace of oxidization right down for the corrosion of iron by rusting, the amount of energy released is no longer sufficient to produce a flame. But still, similar patterns on the surface are formed. This is like what happened to Endurance. It was not quickly sunk. The pressure mounted up against the ship by the ice caused corrosive damage over time. Leaks formed and damage was done. By early September, Shackleton describes the ship as being like a crushed toy, and some of the doors aboard would no longer close. But the ice vice that was cracking the ship was also holding the ship in place. A late cold snap in September drops temperatures to -47, a kind of cold that hardly matters whether that is degrees Celsius or degrees Fahrenheit. Previously, the dogs would eat the snow, but the crew now needs to melt ice so that the dogs can drink. In early October, the rate of movement of the ice floes increases, but it is a very jerky motion. It moves suddenly and then nothing, it stops. This is so powerful and so sudden that one of the crew is knocked out of the crow's nest. The ice begins to break up further and the rudder becomes more visible. The crew are relieved to see that it is not as damaged as they had feared. By mid-October, the rate of thaw has increased and the ship is dripping as it sheds its winter encapsulation. The crew even moves to summer quarters in the upper cabins and spirits are high. Despite the slow burn sinking of Endurance, there remains hope that they may be released from the ice. Endurance gets ready to sail as the ship is turned upright since the vice grip has loosened. On October 14th, the incredible happens. Endurance is freed from the ice, and the crew is able to sail. They only make it a few hundred yards, a couple of lengths of the ship, but they have tasted freedom. The ship is still seaworthy. But upon being recaptured by the ice vice, Endurance would never sail another yard. 3 days later, on October 17th, the ice pressure was so intense that metal floor plates bent and buckled and the ship began to raft or climb up over an ice plate. The stern was raised 9 feet, and on October 19th, the shifting pressure had placed the ship on a 50-degree tilt. Aside from the fear of Endurance completely tipping, everything was now so much more difficult. Walking, cooking, eating, sleeping. Fortunately for the crew, several hours later, the ship righted herself. The thaw that had begun to accelerate now slowed, and water that was opening up amongst the pack ice began to freeze again, cementing the sheets of ice together. On October 24th, the slow burn of corroding rust reached a tipping point. It was like breaking off flakes of metal and seeing the total lack of structural integrity that remained. It began with a great crash from the shifting ice floes against the ship. Once again, Endurance was tilted, this time to 8 degrees. The crew rushed out to find Shackleton already inspecting the damage. The ship was in bad shape. The stern post, which supports the rudder, had nearly torn away. The hull was starting to breach under the pressure and water was pouring in. Structural integrity had been irrevocably compromised. The crew engaged the steam-powered bilge pumps to combat the leaks in the hull. McNish, the ship's carpenter, began building a temporary coffer dam that would buy the ship weeks before the inevitable. This coffer dam was essentially a way of compartmentalizing the leak by building a waterproof wall, an internal hull that would at least slow Endurance's demise. The crew began to gather supplies from the lower decks to the higher decks in preparation to abandon ship. By late October, the weather was beautiful and the daylight was long, but the fate of Endurance was in the throes of its delayed and paralleled winter. This slow burn, slow sink analogy is exemplified by the fact that Shackleton made the call to abandon ship on October 27th. She's going, boys. It's time to get off. Shackleton gave a nod to the efforts that the men had all put in, whilst all at once acknowledging the reality of the situation. This marked a massive shift in their objectives and their resources. Safety and escape could no longer be hoped for from Endurance, so they needed to trek across the ice. The same ice that this whole time had been on the other side of that equation as the foreboding and suicidal alternative to staying with their ship. Suddenly, their hope lay where their fears once resided. The clearest path out was the ice that had trapped them in. Before they set off, they would stay close to the ship for a few nights as they continued to salvage supplies and to scrap what they could reuse from the ship. The night that they had abandoned ship, they were setting up their tents and the ice began to split beneath them. They had to move a further 200 yards to a larger ice floe. No doubt they would not have slept very soundly. They would not have felt completely safe and secure on that first night off the ship. The next night was worse. They were cold, they were uncomfortable, and in the middle of the night, the ice cracked right through the camp. Everyone woke up and scrambled to gather all of their gear and move camp. In the distance, they could hear the death throes of Endurance as her timbers creaked and groaned. The next night, they cast lots for sleeping bags that had been provisioned by a donor from Norway. There were 28 of these reindeer fur sleeping bags. However, they were not all in equal condition, and some had been made of horsehair instead, which were not nearly as warm. 18 of them were of top quality and condition. Shackleton decided that the fairest way to distribute them would be by casting lots. However, it seems that Shackleton and his senior officers secretly manipulated the draw so that they would claim for themselves the worst sleeping bags, whilst giving the crew the warmest and most comfortable ones. Whilst all accounts make it clear that Shackleton ensured everyone was cared for, I haven't been able to find out what they did for their 29th man, Percy Blackborough. I assume that for him, they used some of the bedding from the ship instead of a more portable and efficient warmth to weight ratio that is afforded by a sleeping bag, but I couldn't find an answer to that specific question. In any case, this move of allegedly manipulating the lots so that the highest ranking got the poorest quality sleeping bags was a great morale boost. It also afforded Shackleton the illusion of fairness and plausible deniability, since no one is quite sure how he manipulated the draw. The men would be able to sleep soundly at night in the warmest bags with a clean conscience, without each one feeling the need to plead his own case, or protest and make a show of not wanting to take a warmer bag, but sleeping on the substrate of knowledge that Shackleton really had their back. On October 30th, they finally departed from their camp adjacent to Endurance. Before leaving, they disposed of a lot of valuables that would not serve their survival. Shackleton took the lead by throwing away his gold watch, which was worth 50 gold sovereigns, or roughly 66,000 Australian dollars in 2025. Other items were dropped, scientific instruments and so forth that were valuable to the mission's previous objective. Now, they were counter to the primary objective of surviving across the shifting ice and making it across the water. They named this their dump camp. They set off with the intention to reach an island. They had 3 options in mind. They took 3 boats on runners and all dogs on their sledges. They thought that they may be able to move 5 to 7 miles per day. The first day, they moved 3/4 of a mile. The next day was worse, with heavy snow to move through and yet warm weather. Everything was wet, therefore everything was heavy. They made it another 3/4 of a mile. All night, they could hear the sound of killer whales under the ice. They decided to wait it out and make what they called their ocean camp, here, just 1.5 miles from the ship. The surface was just too difficult to travel on. 2 feet of snow, heavy wet equipment, and lots of it. Since they are camping here, they make a point to live off seals and penguins to conserve their limited rations for later travel. A trek is made back to gather more supplies from the ship and from the dump camp. The slow burn of Endurance sinking means that her deck is now underwater. Frank Hurley famously cut through a thick wall and dived through 4 feet of mushy ice water to rescue his photo negatives, which retains for us the great images that we have of their expedition. They managed to return with all of the ship's flour and most of the sugar. They built a small lookout platform on their ocean camp to keep a lookout for seals and penguins at a distance. For the next week, they are battered by a blizzard that dumps 2 feet of snow on top of all of their gear. The weather is warm enough though, and the juxtaposition of the warmth and the cold highlights their predicament. They could travel more freely across the ice without the snow, but the insulation of the snow provides stability to the ice, which is the 5 feet or so that lies between them and the abyss of the icy Weddell Sea. Sure, they have their lifeboats, but the further that they are able to travel across the ice before entering the water, the less chance they have of critically damaging their boats in the pack ice. But then again, it is impossible to travel effectively when there is 2 to 4 feet of snow to move through with all of their equipment. The blizzard does do them a bit of a favour though, by pushing them further north and thus closer to the islands that they are hoping to reach. As the snow thaws, the crew prepare for their journey, and Endurance sinks deeper and deeper. Finally, on November 21st, Shackleton called out, "She's going," and from 1.5 miles away, the men watched as their last connection to the outside world tipped her stern in the air and then disappeared into the icy depths. Their extreme level of isolation had been consistent since they left from South Georgia about a year ago, but now it felt different. Their home that had been sinking had now sunk. The slow burn was completed. Their tents and supplies were all that they had. The last vestiges of hope attached to Endurance were formally lost to the sea. But even though Endurance was sunk, Endurance was not lost. Not by Shackleton and not by his men. The ship had been named after Shackleton's family motto, "Through endurance we conquer." And through endurance they did conquer. Not the trans-Antarctic trail that they hoped to blaze, but one of the most incredible stories of survival and endurance in the face of extreme adversity of all time. But they didn't know that. Not yet. They hoped that theirs would be a story of survival. They prayed that they would all make it home. For the next weeks and months, they had favourable drifts on the ice taking them closer to their target islands, and they prepared for their trip into the water. But they weren't able to effectively travel across their ice floes, and so they were largely just biding their time. On December 22nd, they celebrated their Christmas and ate the bulk of their luxuries that they would not be able to take with them further. January, February, and March, they were still on the ice. On March 22nd, they witnessed a large iceberg plow into another floe of ice. It ripped through with powerful carnage, and the men pictured the deadly impact it would have had if it had struck their camp. The next day, they saw land for the first time in 16 months, Joinville Island. But it was too far away for them to reach it, too much pack ice in between for them to make it. They saw more land the day after that, but they were drifting past it. On March 30th, they woke up with a shock at 5 a.m. as their floe had split in two. They worked for an hour to move their supplies onto the same piece of ice. It seemed as though some of the men may be stranded on a separate piece of ice, and they might have to mount a dangerous expedition in one of the lifeboats to go and collect them, risking damage to the vessel. But eventually, they were brought back with a swell, and they were reunited. However, now the ice that they are all on is roughly a quarter of the size that it had been. A couple of days later, it split in half again. Finally, on April 9th, conditions were good enough for them to make a break for it and enter the water to head for Elephant Island. They called their shot. They had no way of knowing if the conditions would be better or worse the next day. They had no way of knowing if this was the right time. But it seemed the best opportunity that they had, and so they took it. 3 boats, navigating around the pack ice and across the large swells of the Weddell Sea. They made it to Elephant Island on April 15th, and we will leave them here for this episode. It's an unbelievable story, isn't it? At every turn, as they are nearing some good fortune, the tides change, often literally. Imagine the emotion attached to being able to sail again for the first time in about 9 months, but only for a couple of lengths of the ship, and then getting trapped in the ice again. Never for Endurance to sail again. One of the reasons that I think this story is so inspirational is that it gives a huge perspective shift to how difficult the problems in your business really are. They can feel overwhelming. It can feel like you are drowning. But we have this tendency to take solace in the fact that someone else has it worse, don't we? It's not necessarily malicious, but we can appreciate on a human level that if they can handle that, surely I can handle this. There's a psychological term for this: counterfactual gratitude. The gratitude that arises from realizing it could be worse. Comparing what we don't have to put up with, or thinking about the things that we do have that we would be so hurt to lose. Additionally, think of the pivots that Shackleton and his men had to make. Over the course of their journey, everything changed. The weather and seasons changed. Their food changed. Their objectives and visions changed. The value of items and resources that they had changed. Their situation and living conditions changed. Their sources of hope and of threats changed. Their tools changed. Their roles changed. Their definitions of success changed. Their time horizons changed. They were at times thinking in weeks and months, and at other times surviving by minutes and hours. All of this resulted in their identities changing. This reminds me of the Dan Martell quote I used in the "Your Kids Are Watching You" episode. The person who starts the journey can't finish it. Ernest Shackleton was knighted in July of 1909 after returning from the Nimrod expedition. He had led the British Antarctic expedition further south than anyone had gone before, reaching within 97 miles of the South Pole. Though he didn't claim the pole, he returned with his men alive, bringing significant scientific results, mapping previously unknown regions, and displaying leadership that was praised for its prudence. He had turned back rather than risking the death of his men in pursuit of being the first to reach the South Pole. So his knighthood was explicitly a recognition of his leadership, courage, and scientific contribution. Now think about that for a second. Shackleton didn't become gallant, selfless, and worthy of honor because of the knighthood. He already was that man in action before he had the title. That's how he earned his knighthood. His men on the Nimrod expedition saw and lived under those qualities before society officially gave him a stamp of recognition. Knighthood wasn't the making of Shackleton. It was just formal recognition catching up to an identity that he had already lived. And that's how it works in your life and in your business. You don't suddenly become the type of leader, business owner, or provider once your financial results land or once your industry gives you the award. You grow into that identity first. You become the kind of person who makes those results inevitable. Then, eventually the world catches up with the recognition, the results, the money, or the title. This is the famous principle of be, do, have. You need to be the person who does the things so that you can have the results of those things. Interestingly though, you also have to do in order to be. As a side note, the recordings of Shackleton played in the intro and outro of these episodes are in relation to that Nimrod expedition, not the Endurance expedition. Another thing that I found fascinating about Shackleton's leadership was him taking the lead at the dump camp by ditching his watch that was worth 50 gold sovereigns. Realistically, that would not have helped them achieve their goals, aside from the morale boost that it would give for the men to see that Shackleton was not above making a sacrifice for this expedition as well. The watch would not have held them back. The watch was not a part of the luggage or the equipment or anything else that was slowing them down across the snow. But it was symbolic of Shackleton putting his needs below the needs of his men. If you enjoyed this episode, check out the brand new Freedom and Profit quest that I have just launched. The link is in the description. The page is themed around coffees, krakens, big dreams, and little changes. So the URL is warplan.au/coffees and krakens. Check it out. That's it. Have an awesome day. Make someone else's day awesome. I love you just the appropriate amount, like take whatever is weird and then take a healthy step backwards from that line. That's exactly how much. If it's weird, you're the weirdo. Catch ya. Bye. Hey, if you enjoyed this, check out the brand new Freedom and Profit quest and get your own customized map from where you are to where your business is going. Chart your course at warplan.au/coffees and krakens. Link in the description.
After this, we 4 men had 1,000 pounds to pull, and we were unable to pull the whole load at once, so we had to relay. That is, we hauled half our load for a mile, then we walked back a mile, and then we hauled the other half up. So for every mile we gained to the south, we had to cover 3 to do it.